Welcome the anointed ones. They didn't need to pull a trigger, they just needed time to do it for them. That's the chilling truth, chosen one. Some people didn't plan to attack you in broad daylight. They planned to watch you decay in silence. They bet on your exhaustion, your anxiety, your disbelief that this nightmare would even make it to a courtroom. They didn't need a weapon. They had your name in rumors, your image in whispers, and your peace of mind on trial. Let's be honest, this wasn't justice. It was psychological warfare disguised in paperwork. They wanted you to crumble before the court date even arrived. You weren't supposed to show up standing, speaking, or sane. By now, they expected you to be a tragic memory, a name they could nod at in pity, while secretly congratulating themselves for winning. But God had other plans. See, here's a fact that most people don't realize. Over 80% of victims of prolonged false accusation and social targeting develop severe trauma symptoms. That's how brutal this game is. It's not just about the lies. It's about the slow suffocation of spirit that happens while everyone pretends not to see. You were meant to break under that pressure. Statistically speaking, you shouldn't even have the mental energy to breathe right now, let alone fight. Yet here you are, not only alive, but more awake than ever. And you've got to admit, it's kind of poetic, isn't it? These people spent years planning your downfall, and you still managed to show up to court with your head high, like a walking plot twist in their own horror movie. They rehearsed your eulogy, but now they have to watch you testify. They whispered about your death, but now they have to hear your voice. You became the very thing they were trying to erase. Living proof that God can turn a setup into a subpoena. So yes, they expected you to be gone before that court date came back up. But instead, you're about to walk in with a spirit so alive, it'll make the devil file for an appeal. Number one, they counted on trauma to do their killing for them. They didn't expect a bullet to take you out. They expected the trauma to. They thought the stress would finish what their lies started. They wanted you to slowly disintegrate under the weight of sleepless nights, confusion, and disbelief. They wanted the rumors to starve your spirit, the isolation to eat your confidence, and the waiting to break your mind. They knew that mental suffering doesn't make noise, and they counted on your silence being mistaken for guilt. It was a slow, deliberate kind of killing. No blood, just breakdown. They knew how the human spirit reacts when it's constantly attacked but can't defend itself. They understood that constant anxiety drains a person faster than disease. So they fed you fear in small doses, enough to make you question reality, enough to keep you restless, enough to make you believe maybe the world would be better off without you. They didn't need you dead for justice. They needed you dead for their comfort. Because if you were gone, there'd be no truth left to contradict them. But what they didn't understand is that you were never built on comfort. You were built on purpose. You were never running on people's validation. You were running on divine energy. So, while they were waiting for the trauma to consume you, God was using that same trauma to cleanse you. Every night you broke down, something inside you was being rebuilt stronger. The pain didn't kill you, it refined you. It stripped you down until there was nothing left but truth. They thought time would weaken you, but time turned into your witness. Every day you stayed alive became evidence against their expectations. You became the living contradiction to every prophecy of your destruction. The very stress that was meant to destroy you became the training ground for your rebirth. You stopped being the victim of what they did and became the survivor of what they couldn't finish. Now, your existence alone is a threat. You don't even have to speak. Your presence tells the story. The same people who once pitied you now fear you, because you didn't die where they buried you. You healed where they hid you. And that, chosen one, is why your survival is the loudest revenge heaven ever allowed. Number 2. Your existence became their legal nightmare. Your survival became their biggest legal problem. They built their lies on the assumption that you wouldn't live long enough to challenge them. You were supposed to disappear quietly, emotionally, mentally, or physically, before anyone started asking real questions. They thought by now the story would have closed itself with your absence, but instead you showed up breathing, standing and holding truth like a weapon they can't confiscate. Your presence is the very evidence they tried to destroy. They never expected the person they accused to still have a pulse, much less a voice. Every time you speak, every time you walk into that courtroom, it disrupts their script. They spent so much time perfecting a story where you were the villain that they didn't prepare for a version where you'd survive long enough to tell your side. You are the contradiction to everything they presented as fact. You are living, undeniable proof that their truth was built on fabrication. That's why your existence frustrates them. You being alive keeps reopening a wound they wanted to close. Your voice keeps echoing through the same halls they once controlled. They can't rewrite history without killing the one who remembers it. You are the memory they can't erase. And now, every time they try to twist the narrative, your survival stands in their way like a divine objection. What makes it worse for them is that your life exposes their coordination. You've outlived their gossip networks, their secret meetings, and their fabricated testimonies. Their lies start falling apart just by you continuing to breathe and function. The energy they spent trying to bury you now feels wasted, because the person they thought was gone is suddenly walking into the courtroom, calm, grounded, and unshaken. They can't comprehend how someone they emotionally destroyed still carries peace. Your existence has become a mirror, showing them their corruption in broad daylight. It's not your words that convict them. It's your strength. You are the living verdict before the judge even speaks. They thought you'd be erased, but now you've become the evidence. And that's why your survival hurts them the most. Because the one thing they couldn't silence became the testimony heaven decided to keep alive. Number 3. They mistook delay for victory. When the case got delayed, they celebrated. They thought the postponement was a blessing in their favor. They assumed the longer it dragged out, the weaker you'd become. They believed time would do what their lies couldn't. Wear you down, drain your spirit, and make you give up. In their minds, delay meant defeat. They were sure that by the time the next hearing came, you'd either be too broken to care or too tired to continue. What they didn't know was that time wasn't working for them. It was quietly preparing your victory. Every extra day they thought was your punishment was actually your preparation. You were being rebuilt while they were busy celebrating what they thought was your end. They couldn't see that God was slowing things down so that every hidden thing could be exposed in divine order. The delay wasn't denial. It was documentation. Heaven was gathering every detail, every secret conversation, every deceptive word they spoke in confidence. Nothing was wasted. Every moment of waiting became another piece of evidence being lined up against them. They saw time as a weapon, but you learned to see it as protection. The waiting stripped you of pride, impatience, and fear. It matured you in ways no fast victory ever could. The same waiting they mocked became the space where your discernment sharpened, your faith deepened, and your resilience became unshakable. You learned to stop chasing justice and let justice chase you. And that shift in your spirit terrified them, because they realized they no longer controlled your emotions. While they counted months, you were counting lessons. They spent time trying to predict outcomes, while you spent time aligning with divine timing. They thought you were losing, but you were just becoming untouchable. By the time the court date finally came around, you weren't the same person they targeted. You had evolved beyond their strategy. Now they're panicking because time has turned into their enemy. The same delay they once celebrated is now exposing every inconsistency in their story. What they thought was a victory was actually a setup for revelation. Time didn't destroy you. It testified for you. They thought you were losing control, but you were gaining proof. And now, every tick of the clock is counting down to their exposure, not your end. Number 4. They didn't expect God to reconstruct you while they waited for you to collapse. While they waited for you to crumble, God was quietly rebuilding you piece by piece. They thought your silence meant surrender, but it was transformation. You weren't wasting away. You were being reforged. Every heartbreak, every betrayal, every sleepless night became divine construction material. You weren't being healed just to feel better. You were being reconstructed to never be broken the same way again. They mistook your stillness for weakness, but that was heaven's workshop, where God breaks down what man corrupted and rebuilds it with unshakable strength. They had no idea what was happening behind the scenes of your suffering. They saw tears, but they didn't see training. They saw exhaustion, but they didn't see endurance being built. They thought your isolation meant you were finished, but that isolation was sacred space, where God removed everything artificial from your identity and replaced it with authenticity. While they were gossiping about your downfall, heaven was customizing your armor. The same pain that was supposed to crush you became the forge that shaped you. You stopped being fragile when you realized not every loss was an attack. Some losses were instructions. God stripped you of attachments that were never meant to protect you. He rewired how you see yourself, how you love, how you trust. The collapse they were waiting for never came, because the old you did collapse, and that was the point. What they don't understand is that your breakdown wasn't failure, it was divine demolition. God had to tear down everything that was built on fear before constructing something eternal out of faith. So when that court date came around, they didn't meet the same person they plotted against. The version of you they prepared to destroy doesn't even exist anymore. You walked in carrying peace instead of panic, confidence instead of confusion. They were expecting a victim, but what showed up was a vessel, calm, clear, and covered. You became living proof that divine reconstruction is the most terrifying miracle to anyone who thought they broke you. While they were busy building a case, God was building a warrior. And now the structure he raised in you is too divine, too reinforced, and too protected for human hands to ever dismantle again. Number 5. They underestimated the quiet strength of a soul that has nothing left to lose. They thought they could scare you into silence, but they didn't understand what happens when a person loses everything but their truth. Fear stops working. When you've already been dragged through the mud, stripped of reputation, and left with nothing but your spirit, you stop negotiating with pain. You stop caring about public opinion or what people might say next. You become dangerous in the most peaceful way possible, because nothing they threaten you with can touch what's already been burned away. That's the kind of quiet strength they never accounted for. They expected fear to make you freeze. They thought anxiety would choke your voice. But once you've walked through humiliation, betrayal, and loss, what else is there left to fear? You already survived the worst part, being misunderstood. That's when you started living differently. You stopped defending yourself and started embodying truth. You learned that truth doesn't need validation, it just needs endurance. That shift alone made their entire strategy crumble, because they were counting on your panic, not your peace. You reached the point where death itself lost its grip on you, not because you wanted to die, but because you learned to stop fearing it. You understood that real death isn't when your body stops, it's when your integrity does, and you refused to let deception win that battle. That's why their lies couldn't touch you anymore. They could destroy your image, but not your essence. They could play with your name, but not your nature. You became immune to manipulation because truth became your oxygen. The moment you stopped fighting to survive and started fighting to reveal, the power dynamic shifted completely. You were no longer on defense. You became the revelation they were running from. Every move you made, every breath you took, exposed something they wanted hidden. Your calm became their chaos. Your endurance became their undoing. They didn't realize that when someone has nothing left to lose, they also have nothing left to hide. That's why they fear you now, because you've already faced the fire and came out carrying light. You're no longer playing for survival, you're standing for truth, and truth, once embodied, never dies. Number 6. Their legal strategy was built on the expectation of your emotional death. Their entire plan was psychological from the start. They didn't just want to win a case. They wanted to break your spirit before it ever reached the courtroom. They were counting on emotional collapse, not evidence. They knew the system could be manipulated, but only if you were too tired to resist it. Their legal strategy depended on your silence, your confusion, and your hopelessness. They built their confidence on the assumption that by the time this moment came, you'd be too drained to fight. They wanted a ghost, not a witness. They thought the endless hearings, the delays, the rumors, and the isolation would wear you down so badly that you'd stop defending yourself. They wanted you numb, because numb people don't speak. They wanted you discouraged, because discouraged souls don't show up. Everything they threw at you was meant to train your emotions to surrender before the judge ever entered the room. That was their real courtroom, your mind. And for a while they thought they were winning it. But what they didn't calculate was how much strength pain teaches. While they were betting on your emotional death, you were quietly learning endurance. They didn't know that the same exhaustion they caused would become your discipline. You learned to survive on purpose, to speak only when it mattered, and to turn your hurt into clarity. They built their arguments on the expectation that you'd lose control, but instead you became the calmest person in the room. Nothing disarms evil faster than peace it can't provoke. Now every time you walk into that courtroom, you're not just defending yourself, you're defying their prophecy. Your voice alone disrupts their whole operation. You standing there with steady eyes and clear thoughts ruins the image they tried to sell. You weren't supposed to have enough strength to breathe, yet you're testifying with truth in your tone. That's divine rebellion, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniably powerful. They built their entire case around your destruction, but your survival already invalidated their foundation. You became the contradiction they can't argue against, alive, stable, and fearless. And now, every sentence you speak doesn't just defend you. It dismantles everything they stood on. Number 7. You became proof that human evil can't outlast divine endurance. They used every tool available: lies, influence, delay, slander. and still couldn't finish you. They tried to outsmart you, outtalk you, and outlast you. They believed that if they kept the pressure long enough, you'd eventually collapse under it. They underestimated what divine endurance looks like. They didn't realize that when God is behind someone, time becomes a servant, not a weapon. They could stretch the process, but they couldn't stop the promise. They built their power on systems that favor control, but those systems are temporary. They depend on exhaustion, on people giving up. Yet you didn't. You stayed through every delay, every attack, every manipulation. You kept breathing when quitting would have been easier. You became the proof that the human heart, when anchored in divine truth, can't be overthrown by human evil. They watched you suffer and thought the silence of heaven meant absence. They didn't know heaven was watching too, letting them expose themselves while you quietly evolved. Your endurance itself became a testimony. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was consistent. Every time they pushed, you bent but didn't break. Every lie they told added another layer to your strength. You kept walking even when you didn't know how the story would end. That kind of resilience terrifies darkness, because it reveals that you're operating under a covenant, not circumstance. You weren't surviving by luck. You were sustained by design. Now your endurance stands as evidence that there's a higher court than any earthly one. You've shown that justice delayed is not justice denied when God is the ultimate judge. The waiting wasn't punishment. It was preparation. The injustice wasn't oversight. It was orchestration. What they meant to stretch became the timeline for revelation. They weaponized everything humanly possible, but your covenant remained untouched. The laws they bent, the rumors they spread, the plans they rehearsed, none could interfere with divine order. What they didn't know is that evil has an expiration date, but endurance doesn't. You lasted longer than their lies. You stood taller than their schemes. And now, you are the living evidence that divine endurance always wins the long game, because it's built on something time can't corrupt: truth. Number 8. They confused your isolation for weakness, not realizing God was conducting an internal investigation. They thought cutting you off would crush you. They believed that isolating you would break your confidence, make you question your worth, and leave you desperate for their approval again. They assumed that without social validation, you'd fold. But what they didn't understand was that isolation wasn't their power. It was God's plan. While they were busy excluding you, heaven was busy examining everyone who surrounded you. Your loneliness wasn't punishment, it was a divine audit. God wasn't trying to hurt you. He was revealing hidden hearts. The silence that felt unbearable was actually sacred space. Every person who disappeared wasn't an accident. It was exposure. You didn't lose people. You lost access to actors. Every loyal friend who ghosted you was a truth being uncovered. Every connection that went cold was a character test being failed in real time. You were never abandoned. You were being filtered. God was separating genuine from counterfeit, and that process always happens in solitude. While they celebrated your isolation as a win, heaven was taking inventory. Who stood beside you when your name was dragged? Who stayed kind when the crowd turned cruel? Who defended you when it wasn't convenient? Those questions weren't for you. They were for them. And one by one, the masks started falling. People you once trusted revealed their real intentions, not through confession, but through absence. You learned that solitude isn't emptiness, it's clarity. You stopped mistaking company for connection. You stopped calling everyone who smiled at you safe. Isolation taught you what discernment really means, to see beyond words and into energy. And as painful as it was, that revelation became your strength. You became spiritually sharp in ways you never would have been surrounded by noise. By the time the storm settled, you didn't just come back with new boundaries. You came back with upgraded vision. You could spot manipulation before it spoke. You could sense deceit before it acted. What they thought was weakness turned out to be your training ground. God wasn't hiding you from people. He was protecting you from pretenders. And now, the same isolation that was meant to break you has become your confirmation that heaven was never punishing you. Heaven was just cleaning house. Number 9. They planned for your death but forgot you were already resurrected. They plotted your end with confidence, believing their schemes would finally erase you. What they didn't realize was that the person they were targeting no longer existed. They were aiming at a version of you that had already been buried, the one who needed validation, who cared about approval, who fought to be understood. That person died the moment you surrendered to your calling. They were attacking a ghost while your true self had already stepped into resurrection. You weren't living for survival anymore. You were living for purpose. And purpose doesn't die. They tried to kill your reputation, but God had already crucified your ego. They tried to kill your peace, but you'd already made peace with pain. You weren't the same fragile version they remembered. You were rebuilt in a different dimension of strength. Every attempt they made to destroy you only revealed how untouchable you had become. You can't bury someone who's already been resurrected. All you do is confirm their divinity. That's what confuses your enemies most. They keep replaying old tactics that no longer work, not realizing resurrection changes the rules. You've transcended the level they still fight on. Their weapons are still human: gossip, manipulation, deception. But your armor is divine. They keep trying to fight you in the flesh, not knowing your victory was already sealed in the spirit. That's why no lie could stick, no plan could hold, and no curse could land. You can't defeat someone whose story was rewritten by God himself. You became proof that destiny can't be killed, only delayed for revelation. Every setback was a setup for the unveiling of your strength. Every attempt to destroy you became a divine announcement that something powerful was still alive in you. They were so busy planning your funeral that they missed your rebirth. And now, you're walking proof that resurrection isn't just about coming back. It's about coming back different. They thought they ended you, but all they did was remove what was never needed. The old version of you had to die so the real one could live. They planned for your death, but heaven scheduled your debut. You're not back for revenge. You're back as evidence that resurrection power doesn't negotiate with corruption. It replaces it. Number 10. They wanted your death, so they could rewrite the story without resistance. They didn't just want you gone, they needed you gone. Your disappearance was essential to their version of events. A dead person can't testify, a silenced soul can't correct the narrative, and a broken mind can't recall details. That was their plan all along, not just to eliminate you, but to erase your ability to speak truth. You weren't hated because you were wrong. You were hated because your truth was stronger than their lies. The story they built couldn't stand if you were still breathing, so your destruction became their strategy for control. They worked hard to create a reality where they were the victims and you were the villain. They rehearsed it until they believed it. They spread their version of events through whispers, documents, and systems, thinking no one would ever question it once you were gone. But the moment you survived, the entire foundation of their illusion started to shake. They didn't just fear you showing up. They feared you remembering. They feared your words, your evidence, your calm. They feared that one day you'd stand and tell the truth with so much clarity that their entire house of deceit would collapse. Your existence has become their biggest inconvenience. Every time you speak, you undo something they thought was permanently sealed. Every time you stand tall, you rewrite a lie they spent years building. They can't control the story anymore because the living version of it refuses to die. You are the contradiction they can't delete, the witness they can't silence, and the truth they can't bury. They called it justice, but it was theater. They called it closure, but it was cover-up. They wanted you dead because they needed control over the narrative, and control dies in the presence of truth. What they didn't anticipate is that your voice would only grow stronger with time. The very words they tried to suppress became the words that exposed them. Now your truth lives louder than their lies. You don't even need to argue. Your presence alone dismantles their fiction. They didn't want to destroy you out of hatred. They wanted to rewrite history without resistance. But destiny refused to sign their script. Your survival rewrote the ending they thought was already published. Number 11. The system isn't just testing you, it's exposing them. They built the courtroom like a cage, thinking it would trap you. They believed the legal system would bend you, confuse you, and crush your spirit. They assumed that by the time you stepped inside, you'd be worn down, intimidated, and easy to control. But the system didn't work the way they planned. Instead of breaking you, it became the arena where their true colors were revealed. Every document, every testimony, every rule they tried to manipulate started turning against them. You weren't just a participant in their scheme. You were the proof they never intended to create. Every lie they planted, every false statement they crafted, every manipulation they relied on, became a thread unraveling their entire operation. Their plan depended on your compliance, your exhaustion, your silence. When none of that happened, the system began exposing their deceit instead of yours. The same structure they tried to weaponize became their undoing. It's ironic how the system, which they thought was their greatest asset, became the instrument of revelation. All the delays, all the paperwork, all the rules they twisted to their advantage. They didn't account for divine timing and scrutiny. Every attempt to use procedure to suffocate you turned into a spotlight on their corruption. What they thought would humiliate you is now humiliating them. Every witness, every statement, every legal maneuver they counted on is slowly becoming the evidence that paints them in their true light. You didn't just survive the courtroom, you exposed it. You didn't just endure their attacks, you turned their weapons into mirrors. They wanted to control the narrative, but the narrative is now controlling them. The system was supposed to hide the truth, but it's revealing it instead. What they expected to be a victory is slowly becoming their most visible defeat. You were never the defendant in the divine sense. You were the exhibit of truth, a living demonstration that deception cannot stand when measured against endurance, clarity, and faith. They weaponized rules, but you weaponized patience and presence. Every move they made to trap you is now feeding the evidence against them. The system was testing you, yes, but more importantly, it was exposing them. And with every passing moment, it's clear who the real casualties are. Number 12. You are walking proof that psychological warfare fails against a chosen mind. They didn't just try to ruin your reputation, they tried to rewrite your reality. They wanted you questioning every memory, every thought, every instinct that once anchored you in truth. They wanted your confidence replaced by confusion, your discernment replaced by doubt. But psychological warfare only works on those who are disconnected from themselves. You, however, are a chosen one, and chosen ones don't get lost in illusions, they decode them. When they played their mind games, you didn't panic. You studied. You observed. You began noticing the patterns in their tactics, the sudden shifts, the emotional bait, the half-truths carefully designed to break your mental rhythm. Instead of drowning in their chaos, you started identifying their fingerprints in every move. That's when the war changed. Because the moment you see through manipulation, it loses its power. You became the observer instead of the victim, and in that shift, you reclaimed your authority. They underestimated what happens when a chosen mind is under attack. They thought confusion would make you desperate, but it made you focused. They thought isolation would make you fragile, but it made you alert. They thought you'd fight for their validation, but you started craving truth more than approval. That's the moment their entire strategy fell apart. Because their control depended on your participation in their illusion, and you stopped playing along. You became too conscious to be deceived. You started noticing the invisible warfare, how they'd mix lies with kindness, chaos with charm, guilt with affection. But instead of absorbing it, you started dissecting it. You didn't just survive psychological warfare, you mastered it. You learned how manipulation moves, how gaslighting speaks, how projection disguises itself as concern. You became fluent in deception's language, and that fluency set you free. They wanted to break your mind, but they accidentally strengthened it. They turned you into a psychological expert without realizing it. You now recognize emotional warfare from miles away because you've lived through its finest version and survived it. You became walking proof that no amount of deception can destroy someone who knows who they are. That's why they fear you now, because what used to confuse you now exposes them. Number 13. They didn't know the court they needed to fear wasn't on earth. They were so obsessed with earthly power that they forgot where true authority resides. They thought the only courtroom that mattered was the one with wooden benches and human judges. They didn't know your case had already been reviewed, stamped and sealed in a court that no man can bribe. Before they ever filed their false claims or forged their stories, heaven had already spoken on your behalf. Do not touch my anointed. That wasn't a suggestion. It was a decree. And divine decrees don't expire. They spent sleepless nights plotting how to manipulate systems, twist facts and silence your truth. But while they were strategizing in darkness, heaven had already passed a verdict in light. Every demonic assignment attached to your name was dismissed before it could even take form. That's why their plans never quite connected. That's why death never found you, no matter how close it came. Because the judge of all judges had already ruled in your favor before they even got the chance to speak against you. They put their faith in human paperwork. You put yours in divine providence. They leaned on earthly lawyers. You leaned on the advocate who never loses a case. They assumed power came from influence and connections, but you knew better. You understood that when God handles a case, there's no appeal, no retrial, and no reversal. Once heaven declares protection over you, even the grave loses its claim. They were terrified of human exposure, but they should have been terrified of divine justice. Because when heaven opens a file, there's no hiding evidence. Every hidden lie, every secret plot, every deceptive word is recorded in spiritual archives. And when the timing is right, those records surface in ways that silence entire systems. That's what's happening now. They're being haunted not by your revenge, but by divine remembrance. The irony is, They believed the court date would end you, but it only revealed who was really on trial. Because while you were being accused on earth, they were being judged in heaven. And that's the court they didn't prepare for. The one that doesn't need witnesses, documents, or appeals. It just needs truth. And the truth has already testified for you. Number 14. You walking into that courtroom. Alive is the loudest testimony heaven could present. Your very presence in that courtroom dismantles their entire narrative. They expected to see a broken, defeated, half-alive version of you, someone trembling under pressure, barely able to stand. Instead, you walked in with breath in your lungs, light in your eyes, and peace that made no sense to anyone watching. That alone was enough to silence every false witness. You didn't have to speak loudly or defend every accusation, because your survival spoke the language of victory that no lie could translate. They built their confidence on the assumption that you'd never make it this far. They thought the stress, the manipulation, the sleepless nights, the emotional sabotage would take you out before you ever reached that courtroom. They underestimated divine endurance. You're not just alive, you're aware, composed, and spiritually armored. That's not coincidence. That's evidence. Because when someone goes through hell and still walks into the courtroom standing tall, it's no longer about defense, it's about demonstration. You became the demonstration of what can't be killed, manipulated, or silenced. They rehearsed their accusations, fine-tuned their lies, and prepared to face a ghost of the person they once tried to destroy. Instead, they were confronted by someone they couldn't recognize anymore, because the pain that was supposed to bury you became your rebirth. Every sleepless night became wisdom. Every betrayal became strength. Every attack became immunity. So when you walked into that room, it wasn't just a person entering, it was divine evidence stepping forward. You were the living proof that truth doesn't die under pressure, it thrives in it. They can argue laws, they can twist words, they can present documents, but they can't argue the fact that you're still here. The courtroom may revolve around earthly procedures, but your existence is a spiritual verdict made visible. You are heaven's rebuttal to every false statement, every demonic plot, every whispered lie. You don't need validation from that judge or jury, because your very survival is heaven saying, case closed. The fact that you're alive, mentally, spiritually, and physically, is not just luck. It's divine objection sustained. You walking in that courtroom wasn't just attendance, it was testimony in motion. From the very first moment they plotted against you to the day you walked into that courtroom alive, everything they thought would destroy you became the proof of your endurance. Every attack, every delay, every lie was designed to break your spirit, but it only revealed their corruption and strengthened your resolve. What they expected to bury became the foundation of your resurrection. Every sleepless night, every betrayal, every moment of isolation wasn't punishment. It was preparation. You were being refined, rebuilt, and armored by forces they could never understand or control. They counted on your collapse, your silence, and your despair, but you turned every attempt to break you into evidence of your divine protection. You became the contradiction to every false statement, the living testimony that human schemes cannot outlast divine purpose. They tried to manipulate systems, distort reality, and rewrite history. But every strategy failed against the power that sustains the chosen. The courtroom, the lies, the delays, they all became a stage for truth to shine. You weren't just surviving, you were exposing, revealing, and redefining everything they thought they controlled. Your endurance isn't just personal triumph, it's proof that the divine timing, divine justice, and divine protection always exceed human planning. Every tactic meant to destroy you became a tool that revealed the truth about others, about systems, and about your own extraordinary resilience. Your survival, your composure, and your clarity are louder than any argument, stronger than any attack, and more convincing than any evidence they tried to fabricate. You didn't just overcome, you became the living law, the undeniable testimony, the embodiment of what no lie can touch. So remember this, chosen one, everything they planned, everything they feared, everything they tried to control was already under divine observation. Every step they took toward your destruction was a step into their own exposure. And today, you are not just alive, you are vindicated, empowered, and unstoppable. Your journey is the ultimate statement that truth always prevails, faith always conquers, and divine purpose cannot be derailed by human malice. If this message resonated with you and reminded you of the strength, protection, and purpose that exists beyond human understanding, make sure to join our community. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected to more empowering content, like the video to support this message. Comment your thoughts and victories to inspire others, and share it with anyone who needs to witness the power of resilience and divine endurance. Your story matters, your voice matters, and together we reveal what the world wasn't ready to see. God bless you.